Hi folks, hope you're enjoying and benefiting from our guitar lesson series. Remember, it's essential that you watch these lesson videos in order. Each lesson leads into the next, and you won't get the big picture if you skip any of the steps. Many of you have been searching for these answers for years. You might be tempted to jump ahead and look at lesson 24 because you're into the blues, but if you don't know your intervals and modes from lesson 12 and 17, you just ain't going to get it. Consider purchasing the 150-page official course handbook for $19.95 from our website at www.absolutelyunderstandguitar.com. You'll find that link multiple places here on our YouTube channel. Each of the 32 video lessons has a corresponding printable page that you can view to help with review and memorization. All of the charts and graphs I create in the videos are reprinted there. The package also includes our amazing chord, scale, and arpeggio encyclopedia containing most every useful finger pattern known to man. Reserve your copy today. If you like what you're learning here, tell all your friends and like and subscribe to our channel. So enjoy this lesson and continue on, and you will absolutely understand guitar.
Hi, welcome back to Absolutely Understand Guitar. I'm Scotty West. Today, we take our first look at musical notation, understanding how music works in written form. Many people are intimidated by notation, but it's really quite simple if you understand how it works. This is lesson 9, so make sure your book is open to page 9. All set? Here we go. Hi, welcome back. Now, before we start talking about written music, I just wanted to finish up what we were talking about last time about this 1-5-8 business. Remember, where did the whole 12-note pitch system come from? We told you that whole story about the cavemen and all that stuff, you know what I mean? But the thing you really want to take away from that discussion are, what are the 3 most important notes in all of music? 1, 5, 8. And in the end, this led to the creation of our whole 12-note system. An awful lot of the pitch relationships that we hear and that we see in music all are kind of derived from this right here. Now, I think we left off last week mentioning that all power chord that you hear so much in hard rock music is just 1-5-8. 1-4-5 chord progressions kind of directly come from 1-5-8. Remember, not only are these the 3 most important notes in all of music, but the distances that separate them, the intervals that separate these notes, are some of the most important intervals in music. The distance between note number 1 and note number 5 is called a perfect fifth. The distance between note number 5 and note number 8 is called a perfect fourth. Of course, you already know that from 1 to 8 is an octave. In a few hours, we're going to be talking in depth about how intervals work and all that stuff, so you'll be learning a lot more about these intervals too. But the last thing I wanted to remind you of about this 1-5-8 is this is a pitch pattern, isn't it? This is one of our 50 pitch patterns that you would want to know about. And remember, ultimately, you have to know each pitch pattern 4 different ways. You have to understand it as a concept, which you pretty much do at this point right here. You have to recognize it when you see it written on paper. We're going to be looking at musical notation today, and later on when we talk about intervals in depth, you'll see how these intervals are written on paper. You also have to know how to play it on your instrument. We mentioned last week this power chord finger shape. If you look back at your finger chart of the different chords, you know that this chord here is that thing called a power chord, or a 5 chord, has that characteristic shape, and that's what 1-5-8 looks like on the neck of your guitar right there. One last thing I want to show you about fingering on the guitar is if we could just look for a moment at this finger chart right here for a major scale. Remember, all of your notes and all of your intervals are derived and have and their names come from how they relate to the intervals in a major diatonic scale. Remember this: do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. 1 whole step to 2, whole step to 3, half step to 4, whole step to 5, whole step to 6, whole step to 7, half step to 8. Well, look at this: 1-5-8, 1-5-8. Right within your major scale finger pattern is a power chord shape. Doesn't that look like that power chord I was just playing? Your root note is there that I was playing with my index finger, and then 1 string over and 2 frets up, and then on the same fret on the next string, 1-5-8. That's what a power chord looks like. And of course, it would be right there in your major scale fingering, wouldn't it? Now, later on, you're going to find out that there are more fingerings for a major scale. And so there is another common fingering for 1-5-8, but certainly we can see that relationship there. Now, so remember, there's 4 ways you have to know your pitch patterns. You got to know it as a concept. You've got to know it when you see it written on paper. You've got to know how to finger it. Most importantly, you've got to know what it sounds like. You've got to ear train these things. Remember, ear training is the most important concept that you ever heard me mention at this point. You would ultimately like to know what 1-5-8 sounds like. And a way that many times that you actually ear train patterns of pitch is by learning to associate them with a particular piece of music that you might be familiar with, and then whenever you want to hear in your mind's ear what that particular pitch relationship sounds like, you just conjure up that composition, that piece of music in your mind that will remind you of that. Now, for my private students, I play this for them on the keyboards. I can't really do this in the orientation we have here, but I would just like to remind you that a very good crutch that you can use to remember what 1-5-8 sounds like is that very famous piece of classical music. A lot of you folks will associate it with the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's that big orchestral piece that goes dun, 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 ba-da, boom, boom, boom. You know that piece I'm talking about right there? If you've got a recording of that or whatever, listen to it. That melody to that piece right there. Ba, ba, ba. That's what 1-5-8 sounds like. And eventually you get to the point where, like, if you could hear, and now we don't have to look at the keyboard, if you just hear any particular note like this, you get to the point where you can hear that relationship. How about off this note? By thinking of that piece, I can remind myself what 1-5-8 sounds like. So, 4 ways to know any pitch pattern. 1-5-8, understand it as a concept, understand it when you see it in written form, know how to finger it on your instrument, and finally, ear train it so that you know what it sounds like. 1-5-8, and that's that. Now, that's all I wanted to tell you about that, about the caveman thing. On to our main subject for today, which is reading music. Remember, the 6 main areas of music: pitch, rhythm, timbre, dynamics, technique, and notation. Ultimately, if you want to be a real musician, you got to, at least on some level, you've got to be able to read music. Also, we saw notation again when we were talking about the 4 ways to know your pitch patterns. As we were just mentioning, one of them is you've got to be able to recognize this stuff when you see it in written form. There are several different styles of notation for the guitar. There are 3. I think we mentioned them when we were back there talking about notation. There's standard notation, there's what's called tablature, and also even those little chord boxes that you're familiar with, so many of you are familiar with, that actually just graphically show you where to put your fingers on the neck. Those are 3 different styles of notation for the guitar. The chord boxes are pretty self-explanatory, aren't they? So we're not going to talk about them right now. Tablature, I'm going to try to squeeze in a little bit more talk about tablature at the end of next lesson. But for right now, we are just going to talk about standard notation. All musicians should at least know something about standard notation. Now, as I mentioned before, a lot of people are scared, nervous, intimidated by learning to read music. It's another one of those areas that many times I think is not presented terribly well. It isn't taught very well, and so a lot of people come off thinking it's really more complicated and difficult than it actually is. I'm going to try to just show you the absolute basics. We're just going to scratch the surface with this subject. Another thing I mentioned before is a lot of people go, why is learning to read music so difficult? Couldn't they have made it any easier? I go, probably not. It's actually a pretty sophisticated little system. People go, then why is it so difficult? I go, well, remember, music is a language. Learning to read any language can be difficult and time-consuming. You didn't learn to read the English language overnight. You worked on that for 4 or 5 years, you know, from first grade to 5th grade, say, before you could really pretty much read anything you wanted. Another question people have about notation is they go, how come my last guitar teacher stuck me in an exercise book and made me play Mary Had a Little Lamb and Twinkle Twinkle Little Star till I was so bored I wound up giving it up? I go, well, if you're going to pursue a notationally based way of learning to play your instrument, that's pretty much how you have to start. Remember, when you started reading the English language, you didn't start off reading Shakespeare. You started off reading See the Cat Run. You know what I mean? The only way you learn how to read any language is you have to start off brain dead simple, and then over a period of months or years, going through exercise book 1 into exercise book 2 into exercise book 3 into exercise book 4, you learn to read more and more complicated things until you finally get to the point where you can pretty much read anything you want. So, our subject for today is the whole subject of musical notation. How do you read standard notation on the guitar? Well, pretty simple, really, in the end, if you get it explained right. And they didn't do this terribly well with me. It wasn't until kind of years later that people started saying some things to me that really made sense and allowed me to go back and really develop my reading better. First thing that they should really have told you about written music is this. Written music is a graph. Written music is a graph. Now, it has other features beyond that, too, which we'll also be talking about. But one thing you want to realize is written music is a graph. And you know what graphs are. You've seen them in your school books and stuff like that. It's a graphic way of representing information. And as you also know, graphs typically have two axes, a vertical axis, an up and down axis, and a horizontal axis that goes across the page. And first thing we would like to understand about written music is what these two axes in the graph of music actually represent. We have a vertical up and down axis, and we have a horizontal aspect. These two axes represent two of, well, I want to say, the most significant of the 6 main areas of music. Remember your 6 main areas of music? Hope you got them memorized by now. Pitch, rhythm, timbre, dynamics, technique, notation. These two axes represent two of those areas of music. And for example, the vertical axis, as you go higher or lower on the musical graph, what are you going higher and lower in? Any idea? Some of you have had some experience before, might be able to think this through. As you go higher and lower on the musical graph, you are going higher and lower in pitch. You are playing different notes of different highness and lowness. So the vertical axis of the musical graph is pitch. What is the horizontal aspect of music? As you proceed across the page, what are you proceeding through? Well, the answer is time. As I go from left to right on a piece of music, I play this note first, and then I play the next note after that, and then I play the next note after that, and then I play the next note. So I'm proceeding through time as I go across the page. What is the word in the 6 main areas of music that most relates to time? That's rhythm, isn't it? So for the most part, rhythm can be thought of as being the horizontal aspect of the musical graph. So all music is basically telling you is at what point in time you should play a note of a particular highness and lowness in pitch. And if you think of it, it's really pretty simple that way. You know what I mean? And you proceed across the page and your notes are going up and down and in pitch, and that's how it works. Now, we are going to take roughly an hour to talk about each of these axes because there are symbols and things that you have to understand about both of these different axes. So the first one we are going to look at is the vertical axis, and today we are going to talk about pitch notation, the up-down axis of the musical graph, pitch notation. Now, some of you know about pianos, a piano keyboard, and some of you may know that there are 88 notes on a piano keyboard. That's somewhere in the vicinity of 7 octaves. Another interesting thing that I think you can pretty much assume, I don't know this for a fact, but I've just been assuming this for a long time. If you look at the 7 octaves that a piano will play, that would represent just about the total range of pitch that you're ever going to hear any instrument play in Western music. I do not believe, to my knowledge, somebody can write in and tell me if they know differently, but I do not believe that there are any other instruments in the Western world that play notes that are lower than the lowest note on a piano or higher than the highest note on a piano. So when you're looking at a piano keyboard, 7 octaves, you're looking at basically the entire range of pitch in Western music, somewhere around 7 octaves. Now, one thing you want to understand is when you look at the musical graph here, all that's happening. Now, some of you were taught that silly stuff about every good boy does fine and the word F-A-C-E being the spaces. I'm going to show you some more stuff about that in a while. But the other thing I want to point out to you, the first thing that you need to kind of basically understand about the lines and spaces of the staff, if we can really zero in on this little area right here, maybe right down at the bottom here particularly. Each one of these lines and spaces represents an alphabet letter in the musical alphabet. Now, so if I put a note on this bottom line down here, I might call that A. And there's a note on the line, and then there's a note in the space above that line, and that's just going to be B. If you didn't notice this before, when they were giving you that every good boy does fine and all that stuff, if you look line space, line space, line space, line space, you actually notice that those are actually in alphabetical order. Sometimes they get you to learn that, but they don't actually tell you the most important thing. The lines and spaces are just in alphabetical order. So the next line here would be C then, and the next space above that would be D, and the next line above that would be E. Pretty logical, huh? Line, space, line, space, line, space, just in alphabetical order. Now, this doesn't tell you anything about the sharp and flat notes, does it? We're just strictly talking about the musical alphabet without any sharps and flats involved here. So, when you're looking at the lines and spaces on a staff, the way I'm going to explain it to you right now is to suggest that really these are only notating absolutely the white keys on a piano. Remember, the white keys on a piano are the non-sharp and flat notes. So if we're going up A, B, C, D, E, F, up line, space like that, these are just the white keys on a piano. How many white keys are there on a piano? Well, 7/12 of the notes on a piano, of the 88 notes on a piano are white keys. That's somewhere in the vicinity of 50 white keys on a piano. Now, if I was going to notate all of those 50 notes, those 50 white keys on a piano, I would need a staff that looks like this. It would have, and I counted these, when I drew this out, I counted these, 25 lines with 24 spaces in between them. That would allow me to notate the 50, 49 of course, but the 50 white keys on a piano would require a staff that looks like that. You know, these would be longer too. I just wrote a little chunk of it here, but this is what the staff would have to look like if you were going to notate all the notes on a piano. Now, why don't you ever see staffs that look like that? Well, the answer is this is just too confusing for the human eye. You need to be able to look at written music and figure out what note it is right away. Like, for example, what if I write a note right here? And now I cover it up and I go, okay, you tell me, what space is that on? Which number space from the bottom is that on? You might go, I don't know. Well, I guess it was sort of right in the middle somewhere, so maybe it was space number 12. Well, let's see if we were right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. It's actually on space number 13. I just played a wrong note. I misread that note because it's too big. You can't look at 25 lines and 25 spaces and instantly be able to dissect where you are. So they started going like, well, what are we going to do about this? We need to notate all these notes like this, but we can't have anything that's as visually confusing as that. Well, now I'm making this story up, but I, you know, like I say, this is kind of like my take on it and how this stuff kind of developed. Well, the first thing they said is, you know, these notes at the really high end of the scale and the notes at the really low end of the scale, you don't play those that often. I can tell you as a piano player, I don't wind up being out at the ends of the keyboard all that much. Most of the time, you're kind of playing around in the middle of the keyboard. So they said, well, if we're not playing these really high and really low notes that often, maybe we don't have to include them on the staff that we read on a day-to-day basis. Maybe we can kind of leave them out, and if they have to play those really high or really low notes, maybe we'll give them some kind of special instruction for them to do that. So the first thing they did to simplify the staff was they eliminated the top 7 lines and spaces of the staff and the bottom 7. So let's X those off. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They decided to leave these off, and they decided to leave the 7 at the top. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Off of the staff right there. Now remember, we had 25 lines that we started with, and I've just eliminated 14 of them. That left them with 11 lines in the middle here that were generally considered to be the absolutely essential notes that you were going to have to read on a daily basis to play music. And so they decided to simplify the staff into 7 lines. Like I said, this isn't really historically how it happened. I just think this is a good way of explaining it. Well, how come you don't see a staff that looks like that? Well, the answer is 11 lines is still too many lines for the human eye to look at instantly and be able to tell where they were oriented on the staff. So the next thing they decided to do was they decided to take these 11 lines and kind of grab it in the middle and kind of stretch them apart. They decided to break it into 2 sets of lines, and that's where we see this familiar graph down here. This is beginning to look more like the staff that we're familiar with. Now, notice this. You have 2 sets of 5 lines, and 5 lines is pretty easy. If I put a line somewhere or a note somewhere in one of those lines or spaces, you'd pretty much instantly be able to look at it and tell which line it was on. It's visually manageable for you to deal with. 5 lines. They figured that that was just about the largest number of lines that your eye would be able to take in. Now, these they also needed a system for telling you, these would be the higher pitched notes up here, and these would be the lower pitched notes up here. So they developed these symbols to put on the staff in order to show you which were the higher notes and which were the lower notes. And you're familiar with these symbols. You've seen these before. And particularly those of you who have had some other music lessons before. You're familiar with what are called the clef signs, like that. And all these symbols mean is this is what's called the G clef or the treble clef. And this is, so this is the G or treble clef. And this other one down here is called the F or bass clef. And of course, bass means lower and treble means higher. And there are some other interesting things to know about these particular clef signs. Why do they call that the G clef? Well, you're going to find out at curlicues right there around the G line. You're going to find out that the note that's on that line right there is actually G. And then this one, see how it terminates there on that line there, and there's 2 dots on either side of that line? You're going to find out that the note that's on that line is F. So that's kind of where the clef signs get their names from, they're alerting you to where the particular note is. But the real significance of these clef signs is just to tell you which range are you in. Are you playing, because you don't always see 2 of these. Sometimes players, you will only see 1 line. In fact, most of you, in fact, the guitar is written on just 1 clef. You'll probably recognize that the guitar is actually written on the G clef. You don't ever see the bass clef down here. In a way, what I'm showing you here is how piano music works. And once again, I know you're here to take guitar lessons, but an awful lot of the music you're ever going to come across is written in this style of notation, which has 2 clefs, the upper clef, the treble clef, and the bass clef on the bottom. I'm going to show you in a few minutes how that relates to how guitar music is written. But if you want to understand basic musical notation, you have to understand this concept, this double clef, this double staff concept. When you put those 2 clefs together, this thing is known as what is called the grand staff. The grand staff is this double set of staffs, and there's 5 lines and 4 spaces in each one. Now, if we can look back down here again, remember this. I mentioned that there are actually we had 11 lines that we absolutely need. If I only have 5 and 5, that's only 10 lines. Where's this 11th line? Well, interestingly enough, in this big space here, in between these two clef signs, there is another line, but it's generally kind of left out. It's kind of like an invisible line. I'm going to mark it in here with a dotted line. There is like another 11th line that runs down the middle between these two stabs right here. And there is, interestingly enough, a note that's on that line, like that. And that note right there, that note which is on that invisible line in between the two stabs, the 5-line stabs, is the most famous musical note of all times. Do you know what that is? Some of you are going to know this and some of you aren't. There's 12 notes, right? And they all have alphabet letters. Some of them are sharp and flat, of course, as you know. But otherwise it goes A, B, C, D, E, F, G. What is the most famous musical note of all times? Do you know? Now, some of you guitar players are going to go E or A or G or something like that. Well, actually, no. That really just relates more to popular playing on the guitar. But in the totality of music, if you ever took any piano lessons, if you ever took any band instrument lessons, the absolute first note they always kind of tell you about is C. The note C. Does that ring a familiar bell with you? How many times have people talked to you about the alphabet letter C when they've been talking about music? Not only that, this note right here, which is on that middle line, that invisible line between the two stabs, is even the most famous C of all times. You probably heard of it. It's called middle C. This is kind of your ultimate kind of reference point, particularly if you play the piano. It's this note called middle C. It is the C note that is closest to the middle of the keyboard. And that would, so on this keyboard, that would be middle C right there. C is the note that's always just to the left of the two black keys. So that would be middle C on that keyboard. Now you'll also notice this is not a full piano keyboard, is it? I don't have 7 octaves up here. This is a little electronic keyboard. It's only got, what has it got, like 4 octaves on it or something like that. Anyway, that is the most famous musical note of all times. It's middle C, right in the middle of the staff. Now, let's take a look up here, because now what we really need to see is how the musical alphabet evolves up in this staff here out of this grand staff here. For example, we know we've got our 2 clefs, so we'll write in our G clef up here and our bass clef. And the thing that I'm trying to show you is that this grand staff is one long connected chain of notes that goes up from the bass clef and then continues up into the G clef. A lot of you have been kind of shown this, and you've kind of developed the concept that the bass clef is an independent thing that doesn't have any relationship to the G clef. Like some of you just read the bass clef and some of you just read the G clef, and you've never seen that they really all connect together like we saw over here into one long chain of notes centered on this note, which is that middle note right in the middle that we call middle C. Now, the best way to think of that is then, as we mentioned back here, line, space, line, space, line, space, line, space. This is alphabetical order. So there's this note C, which is on that invisible middle line, and they just put a little partial version of it. That's what's called a ledger line right there. They don't write the whole line in. They just make a little snippet of it right there that the note runs through. There's a note that's on that line, and then there's a note that's in the space above that line. And there's another note that's in the space below that line. And if these are in alphabetical order, then, of course, this must be D here, and this must be B down here. B, C, D, just in alphabetical order. And they occupy this space. Even though it's a large space, there's really only, you want to think, I'm oversimplifying a little, and I'll undo that later on, but you really want to think that even though there's this large space in between these two staffs, there's really only 3 notes there. Middle C on the invisible line between them, D above it, B below it. From there on, you are simply into the lines and spaces of the staff itself, like this, and you're just going up in alphabetical order. Line, space, line, space, line, space, line, space, line, space. Now we'll go up to there so far, and then also you trace this down in reverse alphabetical order down this way. Line, space, line, space, line, space, line, space, line, like that. Now, this is just alphabetical order, centered on C right there. Let's go up first. If that is middle C right there, then the next note right above it would be D. And then the line, the first bottom line of the G clef is E. You probably already know that if some of you have already had some music lessons, because remember they taught you every good boy does fine. They taught you that the bottom line of the G clef is actually an E note. Now you see why, because if you just work up from middle C, line, space, line, that note has to be an E. The first space then is F, isn't it? Remember they taught you that the spaces read F-A-C-E. Again, you're going to see that all works together in alphabetical order. The next line then is G, and the next space is A, and the next line is B, and the next space is C, and then D, E, F, and we stopped right here for now at the space just above the staff, and that would be G. You see, it's just alphabetical order. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Now look at this. E, G, B, D, F are the lines. That's why they tried to teach you this every good boy does fine. Look at the spaces. F, A, C, E, the word face. Lots of times they teach us that stuff, and they never point out to us that the real logical way of looking at that is it's just alphabetical order. Now, in reverse, if we go in reverse alphabetical order down from middle C, of course, that's got to be B. This line here then is A, and then this is G, F, E, D, C, B, A, G. So that's just alphabetical order too, in reverse alphabetical order going down like this. Now, those are those 11 lines and spaces that I mentioned are the 11 lines and spaces that we really need to make sure that we have, because these are the most common notes. Now, I want to go just a little bit further to show you how they notate these higher and lower notes that are left off the staff on a daily basis. For example, if we get all the way up to the top here, that's not the highest note we can play, right? How do we notate higher notes? Well, they begin to give you little partial lines above that. For example, these, as I mentioned before, these are what are called ledger lines. They give you a little snippet of the line up there, and there's a note that's on that line. And then you can have a note in the space above that line, like that. And then you can have a second ledger line up there with another note on that. You could continue to keep right on going. You could have a note in the space above that partial line right there. But we're going to stop right there for now, because if we stop 2 ledger lines above the G clef, you'll notice an interesting point of symmetry. Because if we continue our alphabet here, G, A, B, C. The note that is 2 ledger lines above the top of the G clef is a C. Remember, we kind of started back here on middle C, so that's just an interesting point that we can look at. Notice there's also another C right here on the 3rd space up. This is 1 octave from middle C to this C right there, and then it's another octave from that C up to that C right there. Now, if we trace this back in reverse direction down here, we notice there's another C right here, so there's another octave from there down to there. And then finally, you can also continue some ledger lines down below this note here. Let's go down 1 ledger line to the space below the ledger line. Whoops, I didn't quite leave enough room here. Down to, again, 2 ledger lines below the bass clef here, because there's an interesting point of symmetry there too. If we start G there, then this would be F, E, D, C. This is another C right here, and that's an octave below this C here. So an interesting thing to note is, if you understand that the grand staff with its 2 different staff symbols here is 1 long, gigantic connected chain of notes, which nobody ever told you, or many of you don't know this, 1 long, gigantic chain of notes, it's about 4 octaves worth of notes that you can play. And that would be that 4 octave range in the middle of the piano where you spend most of your time playing. That, and you're going to find out, these are, again, we're talking piano, aren't we? But we're going to make this all make sense to the guitar in a minute, as we've seen so many times before. To understand concepts in music, really a very good place to start is by looking at the piano, and we're looking at notation for the piano now in the same vein. The grand staff from 2 ledger lines below the bass clef to 2 ledger lines above the G clef is about 4 octaves worth of notes. And that's mostly what you play every day. Now, this should answer the question for you. Some of you who have had some experience with both the G clef and the bass clef often have this question. They go, how come the bottom line of the G clef is E, but the bottom line of the bass clef is G? It's like, how come, why didn't they make them the same? For example, if that's an E, why didn't they make the bottom line of the bass clef an E too? Or if that's a G, why didn't they make the bottom line of the G clef a G as well? Well, the only way a person could ask that question would be if they don't understand that these 2 stabs are interrelated. At which point, if you trace alphabetically the notes, you find out that that has to be a G. See that G right there? If we trace that line across, we find out that it's that G right there. It simply has to be that G. And if we look at this E here, we trace that across to right there, we see that it has to be that E right there. The only way a person could wonder why the lines and spaces of the G clef and the bass clef are different is if they don't understand that these are connected together as one long chain of notes centered on middle C right there. And now, another thing to realize is you don't ever see big notes like this written in that space in between the 2 staffs. So you see all these little notes I wrote, and then I wrote these 3 big notes. You don't ever see big notes written there like that. Let's look over here to the left a little. What's the name of this note right here? If you saw that in the music, right like that, what's the name of that note? Well, the name of that note is C. That is middle C right there. They don't write it as a big note like that, plopped right in the middle of the space there. They generally write it as a regular-sized note with a ledger line through it that is equidistant from the bottom of the G clef right there. They don't write it like a big note in the middle there. They write it so that it's on a line that's equidistant below the G clef right there, and that right there would be middle C. Now, here's another interesting question, though. What's the name of this note? I didn't draw it very well, did I? But that's a line, too. That's a note that's right on a line, a ledger line, too. Interestingly enough, that is also middle C. These 2 notes are the same note. They're both middle C. Sometimes it's written like that with the space equidistant below the bottom line of the G clef. Other times it's written with a ledger line equidistant above the top line of the bass clef. And you might ask, why would they write the same note 2 different ways? Well, there's a variety of different reasons, but one is, remember, we're talking piano music here. Oftentimes music for the left hand is written on the bass clef, and music for the right hand is written on the G clef. So it's kind of like if you saw the note written like that, you'd be more apt to play it with your left hand. And if you saw it written like that, you'd be more apt to play it with your right hand. Now, other notes in this middle range here can also be written as ledger lines too. For example, what's the name of this note? See, that's 2 ledger lines below the bottom line of the G clef. Well, actually, I probably should have put the B first, but that's C on the line, so the note that would be in the space just below that would be B, because that's the next lower alphabet letter. This would actually be an A, wouldn't it? And particularly if it's tied to the G clef, you might play that note with your right hand. That is exactly the same note as this note right here written on the bass clef. That would be A. You see that A right there? See how it's 2 notes below middle C? There's C, B, A. So here it would be like the top ledger line would be C, B, A. So it would be written like that for the right hand. It would be written like that for the left hand. Likewise, what's the name of this note? If I see this here, there's my ledger line that middle C would be on. A note just above that would be a D, which would be the same note as this note right here, which is this D right here. See, just in the space just below the bottom line of the clef is actually a D. That is actually that alphabet letter there. It's a D. They don't write it like that as a big note like that. They write it as a regular sized note there, and you can either have it written like that, where it's just below the bottom line of the staff, or you can have it written for the left hand as the note in the space above the ledger line that would be middle C right there. See how there's C? This is in the space just above it. It would be D. I know that's a little confusing, hard to describe some of this stuff, but if you even get a grasp of that at all, that's okay. Again, a lot of this isn't going to apply to guitar music anyway, but a lot of you probably play the piano as well. A lot of you have noticed that even when you go to the store to buy the sheet music to learn to play the guitar version of the songs you want to play, it's usually given to you on the grand staff. The guitar stuff a lot of times is just represented by those little chord boxes that are on there. But if you want to get some real insight into how the song works, a lot of times, even if you're a guitar player, you're stuck with looking at piano music. So you should know something about how the grand staff works. And that's it. What a lot of people don't understand is it's one long, gigantic chain of notes for 4 octaves, from 2 ledger lines below the staff to 2 ledger lines above the staff. Now, as we said before, this just notates the white keys on the piano. How do you notate the sharps and flat notes, the black keys on the piano, when you're looking at musical notation? Well, there's 2 different ways that this is accomplished. One is you can simply take a particular note, like in this case, if that's a D right there. If we go up in our musical alphabet, we find that, every good boy does. There's the D note right there. That's a D. That note is on the D line, so that's a D. But if they want you to play, for example, D sharp, then what they do is they put a little sharp symbol in front of it like that. So the note is on the D line, but with the sharp sign in front of it, you know to actually play that as a D sharp. Now, what if they want you to play D flat? Well, they give you the note on the D line, but they put a little flat sign in front of it like that. So you would know that that's the alphabet letter D on that line, but with the flat symbol in front of it, you know to play that as a D flat. So there are no lines and spaces intrinsically on the staff that tell you anything about the sharps and flats. They are just the non-sharp and flat notes, and then if they want you to play them as sharps or flats, they give you a little symbol in front of the note. Now, that's the first way that you notate sharps and flats, but there is another way that you see sharps and flats notated in music, and that is what's known as the concept of the key signature. Some of you may know a little bit about this too, and let me show you what that's about. I'm going to start in this measure actually right here because I've kind of blocked myself off here. No, actually, I'll do it down here. This is a better place to do it. Let's say this is the beginning of a song that you're going to play. Some of you have seen stuff like this, and you've got your clef sign. You got your clef signs like this. And also, when we talk about rhythmic notation, you'll often see at the beginning of a piece you have some numbers that tell you some information about the rhythmic content of the music. This is what's known as your time signature, these number 4s here. We'll be talking about what those mean next time. But there's another little very important symbol at the beginning of many pieces of music, or all pieces of music actually, which is what's known as the key signature. And that works like this. Just before you see the time signature, if you look on your lines and spaces here, you might actually see some sharp or flat symbols written right in front of the time signature, right in between the staff and the time signature right there. Now, this is a sharp sign, as you know, we talked about that before. Now, it is drawn on a particular line, isn't it? In this case, I've centered it on the upper line of the G clef. What alphabet letter it is represented by the top line of the G clef? Do you remember? Every good boy does fine. It's an F, right? If you have a sharp sign at the beginning of the piece written on your F line, what that means is as you proceed through the rest of the piece, every time you see an F note, you're not going to play it as a regular old F natural. You're going to play it as an F sharp. The key signature tells you what notes to sharp and flat all the way through the whole rest of the piece. As you go through the piece, the note is not going to have a sharp sign in front of it. Like, so you're reading along and you see this note right here. See how that note is also written right on that F line right there? So you're thinking, oh, that's an F, but you should remind yourself as you go through the piece that you're not actually going to play that as an F. You're actually going to play it as an F sharp, because the key signature at the beginning of the piece tells you that whenever you see an F, you're going to play it as an F sharp. Now, it doesn't even have to just be on that line either. This note right here is also an F, isn't it? If you remember the spaces, that F, that first space is an F, isn't it? The F-A-C-E, the spaces, that's an F. What relationship does this F and this F have? Well, they're an octave apart, aren't they? This is a lower F, and this is a higher F. Now, we don't have, in our key signature here, we don't have a sharp sign on that F space down there, do we? But nonetheless, just because they put it there, that means even that F right there would be played as a F sharp, because the key signature is telling you that wherever you see an F, that could be in the bass clef too. This note here will be played as a F sharp right there, and so will this note down here, which is also an F. All of these, if the key signature tells you to play a sharp, then all of these would be played as F sharp. Now, somewhere along further in the song, they might want you to not play an F sharp. They might want you to play a regular old F. In order to do that, we're going to introduce a new symbol here, which you may or may not be familiar with. You're familiar with the sharp symbol. You're familiar with the flat symbol. If somewhere in the piece, with a key signature of an F sharp right there, if they want you to play a regular old F, an unsharp note, they put a third symbol in front of it. It's called a natural sign. It looks like this. Ever seen that symbol right there? That's what's called, and we'll write it right in this space here. This is what's called a natural sign. And what it actually is meant to do is undo the key signature. In the key signature, you were told that you're supposed to play an F sharp every time you see an F anywhere, but if somewhere in the piece they want you to play a regular old F, they put a natural sign in front of it. And that natural sign, there's all kinds of details with this notation stuff that is beyond the scope of our program to be able to show you. When you get into actually reading music, you're going to be in the exercise book series, or you're going to be maybe working with a private teacher to do that. They will tell you a lot of these details. But, for example, one thing you should know is that if you see what's called an accidental like this, for example, a natural sign, that natural sign would continue to hold through the rest of the measure. But then as you proceed into the next measure of the piece beyond the bar line there, then if you saw another F, for example, after that, would you play that as an F natural or an F sharp? The answer is once you cross the bar line, it reverts back to the key signature again. So if you saw that, you would again play it as an F sharp. Now, the concept of the key signature is a rather difficult, kind of concept to explain to people. I'm going to try to do that now. I'll get my slide rule out here. Again, some of you have had some experience with this, but you may not have actually seen how it works. The whole reason that this is called a key signature is because it tells you what key the piece of music is in. And what key are you playing in if you see a key signature that has one sharp in it on the F line? That's the F line in the bass clef. That's the F line in the G clef. What key is that? Does that mean that you're playing in the key of F sharp? No, interestingly enough, it isn't the key of F sharp. The key signature that has one sharp in it at the beginning of the tune, I look at that and I go, oh, you know what? This piece of music is in the key of G. The key signature for the key of G is one sharp. So this is the key of G. And that has one sharp, and that sharp is F sharp. And you're going, huh? How did you get that? How, by looking at the key signature with one sharp in it, F sharp, how did that tell you that you were in the key of G? Like I said, this is a little bit hard to describe, but remember back when we were talking about the musical number system, we learned the major diatonic scale, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. We also learned that's where the number system comes from, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We also learned like any scale, that is a particular pattern of intervals. It goes whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Or in other words, mostly whole steps except between 3 and 4 and 7 and 8. That's the major diatonic scale. That is the central scale in Western music. Don't let anybody tell you different. You might have heard some other things about pentatonic scales. We're going to put that in perspective for you later on. But the thing you should understand now is the backbone of Western music is the do, re, mi scale, the major diatonic scale. And many things in music and in musical notation harken back to the major diatonic scale. And key signatures is simply another example of that. Now let me show you what I mean. You might recall that the scale side of your slide rule, it says major diatonic modes over on that side, and we looked up in the upper left-hand corner here of our slide rule, didn't we? And we pointed out that, and we'll really need to zoom in here if we can, look at this upper corner here again. We looked at this back when we were talking about the major diatonic scale and about the musical number system. This is the Ionian mode, or the major diatonic scale. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, with half steps between 3 and 4 and 7 and 8. Now, look at this. I have put G here in the first window. So what I'm actually playing here is a G major scale. Well, look at the notes that are in a G major scale. G, A, B, C, D, E. Look at that note right there. F sharp or G flat. And then G. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Starting on G would be all white notes on the piano, except for that one note right there. That would be the one black key. Note number 7 in the key of G would be a black key on the piano. Look which note it is, F sharp or G flat. That is why it is said that the key signature for the key of G has one sharp, F sharp. That's because everything goes back to the major scale. If you want to play a major scale starting on G, you're going to have to play an F sharp. You know what I mean? That's how all key signatures work. I'll give you another example in a second. Another interesting thing to note is, why then is that note called, we're going to answer a question right now that we've had for quite a while. F sharp and G flat are the same note, right? When do you know to call it F sharp and when do you know to call it G flat? A lot of people have a lot of misconceptions about this. They say things like, well, when you're going up the scale, you call it its sharp name, and when you're coming down the scale, you call it by its flat name. It doesn't have anything to do with that at all. That's a very common misconception. The answer is, when do you call a note by its sharp name or its flat name? This is a little, again, oversimplification, but the answer is, it all depends on what key you're in. If we look at the key of G here again, what you're going to see is it's got this note in it right here, right? This one black key. Now, we are in the key of G. Are we going to call that note F sharp or are we going to call it G flat? The answer is, as you already know, we're going to call it F sharp. But why? Well, consider this. If I were in the key of G and I were to call that note G flat, then I would have two notes in the same key with a G name, and I would have no note in it that had an F name. The scale would go G, A, B, C, D, E, G flat, G. Now that probably doesn't make as much sense as calling it F sharp, because then you would go G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G. You would have, each note would have its own individual alphabet letter number. There would be no redundancy. Interestingly enough, the whole reason that you ever call a note by either its sharp name or its flat name all depends on what key you're in, because you're trying to avoid alphabetic redundancy within the key. Now, I'll show you this. Let's take another key. Take your slide rule and set it up so that you're in the key of F. And what that means is you're going to put F as the first note in there. And if you look at what an F major scale is, it's F, G, A, and there's one sharp or flat note in it right there, C, D, E, F. So in other words, if you're going to play an F major scale, if you're going to play in the key of F, remember the key signature always comes back to the major scale. You're going to play 7 white keys and 1 black key, that one right there. That note could either be called A sharp or B flat, right? In the key of F, are we going to refer to that note as A sharp or B flat? Can you answer that question? Well, take a look. In the key of F, that note would be called B flat, because if you called it A sharp, not only would you have A sharp, but you would also have A in the same key. You would have a redundant alphabet letter note. That's how it works. The key signature, by the way, for a piece of music in the key of F, so look over here. Let's say this is the beginning of a piece of music over here. The key signature, if that piece of music was in the key of F, there would be a flat sign on the B line. And what that means is you would play all non-sharp and flat notes, except whenever you saw a B, you would play it as a B flat. That would be the key signature for the key of F. 1 flat. What's that flat? B flat. That's because if you're going to play a major scale, starting on F, you're going to play all white keys. Because of the pattern of intervals, you're going to play all non-sharp and flat notes except for that one, and you're going to call it B flat to avoid alphabetic redundancy within the key. And that, now, how many keys are there that you can play in? Well, at this point in time, we are suggesting that there are 12. Later on, you're going to find out that there's major keys and minor keys and modal keys. But for now, how many keys are there that you can play in music? 12. 1 for each note. Each one of those keys has a different key signature, depending on what sharp or flat notes you are going to have to play in order to execute a major diatonic scale starting on a particular alphabet letter note. Now, we just looked at 1 sharp and 1 flat, but there are key signatures that have 2 sharps and 2 flats and 3 sharps and 3 flats and 4 and 5, all the way up, believe it or not, to 6 and 7 sharps and flats. I'm not going to have time to actually be able to tell you about all that stuff right there. But that's what key signatures are all about. In your support material, you will see that you have a sheet that lists the key signatures for all 12 keys. I'll rattle a few of them off for you just so you'll see. Grab your slide rule. Set it up so that you're looking at a D major scale. You're taking the major scale thing and you're putting D in the first window. How many black keys, how many sharp and flat notes are you going to play? 2. Are you going to call them by their sharp or their flat names? If you look at it for a second, you're going to see that you're going to call them by their sharp names to avoid alphabetic redundancy. So, and that's an F sharp and a C sharp, isn't it? So if you were looking at a piece of music that was in the key of D, you would see that it would have a sharp sign on the F line, but it would also have a sharp sign on the C space right there, indicating that the key signature for that has 2 sharps, but that wouldn't be the key of G, that would be the key of D. The key of B flat has 2 flats, because if you set your slide rule up so that you're playing a major scale starting on B flat, remember there are keys that start on the sharp and flat notes, that you will see that there are 2 black keys you'll have to play. B flat and E flat. The key signature for the key of B flat would have 2 flats in it. It would have a flat sign on the B line, and it would also have a flat sign in the space that is an E note. That would be the key signature for the key of B flat right there, indicating that there's 2 flats in its key signature. The only scale that has 2 black keys notated by their flat names is if you start on a B flat scale. Another interesting thing is there is no such key as the key of A sharp. Remember, B flat and A sharp are the same name, but you would never call a key by it, starting on that note by its sharp name, because then you would have alphabetic redundancy in the key. There is no such key as the key of A sharp. There is only the key of B flat, because that's the only way to avoid alphabetic redundancy within the key. Now, that is the big chunk. Now, like I said, this is a huge subject, and I'm just scratching the surface. I'm not even sure I'm doing such a terribly good job of explaining this to you today. Hopefully, you got that. You can look the tape over a couple more times. This isn't really confusing stuff. It's just kind of difficult to describe. But hopefully, we've given you enough of a look at this. So maybe some of the other stuff you've read, or some of the other stuff that you will read in the future, when you work out with other teachers, the things that they say to you will make some kind of sense in relation to the pitch stuff. Now, the one thing that I haven't gotten to show you today, but that we're going to talk about at the beginning of next time, is the fact that this is piano music, isn't it? Grand staff music, written with your treble clef and your bass clef. Many of you probably know that when you see guitar music, you don't see it written on the grand staff. You see guitar music simply written on the G clef. You don't have an accompanying bass clef when you look at guitar music. And so what we're going to do at the beginning of next time is we're going to translate how written music for the guitar, it's just written a bit differently than music written for the piano, and I'll have to tell you a few things about that. Then we're also going to go on and talk about rhythmic notation too, which in our next subject there. I'm also, if I get some time, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about tablature, just so you have a basic idea. Tablature is another style of notation for the guitar. Pretty easy to pick up on that. I'll leave you with this thought right here. You know that the open strings of your guitar are E, A, D, G, B, E, right? Now, how would those open strings of the guitar look if we saw them written on the grand staff? Oh, actually, they're telling me that I'm out of time now. Actually, I guess we better hold that on until next week. We're going to show you how the notes of the guitar are written on the grand staff. Okay, until then, I'm Scotty West, and I'll see you next time. Have a great time. Keep on practicing, okay? We'll see you then.